Welcome to Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis, the podcast where policymakers, legislators, thought leaders, licensees, and advocates come to discuss the evolving landscape of cannabis in New York and beyond. I'm Herb Barbot, former Director of Operations at New York's Office of Cannabis Management. Each episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with key voices shaping policy, business, and advocacy, plus expert insights on the latest developments impacting the industry. And now for the episode. Welcome to episode 12 of season 2 of Joint Session. This is Herb Barbot, and in this episode, we'll speak with Brian Applegarth, founder of the Cannabis Travel Association International, an award-winning travel innovator and visitor economy strategist. All to say, we'll be talking about the potential for cannabis and tourism in New York State. But before we get to Brian, let's take a spin around this week's news. Researchers from the University of Basel in Switzerland are conducting a clinical trial aimed at starting to crack the cannabis impairment nut. As the clinical trial notes, THC blood concentration is an inadequate marker for assessing driver impairment. Currently, there is no reliable marker available for estimating the time of last cannabis inhalation, which would provide a promising tool for regulating driving under the influence of cannabis. The results of this clinical trial will assist future research aimed at improving the ability to distinguish between impaired and unimpaired cannabis users in road traffic. These findings are of significant importance for road safety and for society at large, as they may provide more objective markers for cannabis inhalation, thereby permitting a method for conducting an acceptable evaluation of driving under the influence of cannabis. In a new letter, Florida Congressional Representatives Kathy Castor and Darren Soto are urging the Department of Health and Human Services Inspector General and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to investigate the diversion of $10 million from a Medicaid fraud settlement in Florida. The money, which was meant for healthcare services, was instead funneled through the nonprofit Hope Florida Foundation, run by Governor Ron DeSantis' wife, and then immediately to political committees, one of which opposed the failed adult use ballot measure last November. The diversion of Medicaid dollars requires immediate investigation. These are proceeds that rightfully belong to serve the citizens who rely on Medicaid, including children, pregnant women, neighbors with disabilities, and those served by long-term care, Castor and Soto wrote in the letter. Therefore, we respectfully urge you to investigate whether or not the $10 million settlement scheme violates federal law and complies with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services legal and regulatory framework and any other applicable federal laws and regulations. A conference committee in the Minnesota legislature completed its work on Friday on a bill to make technical and minor changes to the state's adult use laws ahead of the launch of licensing and sales. The bill would, for example, allow for labs to test products while awaiting accreditation and would allow for product sampling at cannabis events. During discussions around the bill, Representative Jessica Hansen flagged an issue for lawmakers to consider in the next session: localities finding creative ways, including zoning, to ban cannabis shops. A similar issue will be discussed in a future episode with the Long Island Cannabis Coalition. Some of these localities, she said, are flat out exhibiting prejudice against our industry. Others are all but bragging about how they are finding a way to outwit the state and to find ways around the law, she said. Also in Minnesota, Governor Tim Walz, you may remember him last summer hanging around with Kamala Harris, just signed the first of its kind agreement in the U.S. that allows a tribe to sell cannabis off of its reservation. The agreement allows the White Earth Band of Chippewa to open up to 8 retail dispensaries across the state. Eric Talbot, interim director of Minnesota's Office of Cannabis Management, called the agreement with White Earth a nation-leading approach to cannabis compacting in an interview Tuesday with the Minnesota Star Tribune. Under the agreement, White Earth Nation will be required to collect local and state sales taxes, as well as the state's 10% tax on cannabis gross receipts on all off-reservation marijuana purchases. Check out the story in the Minnesota Star Tribune. A multi-agency task force formed in 2022 to combat illegal cannabis in California announced this week its biggest enforcement operations yet. More than a dozen entities, from the DEA to the California National Guard, seized over 105,000 plants and over 22,000 pounds of cannabis in the state's Central Valley, which they say was worth $123.5 million. In all of last year, the task force seized just over $500 million worth of product to put the scale of this latest effort into context. Let this be a reminder to all who grow cannabis illegally. We won't tolerate the undermining of our legal industry and impacts to our environment, Governor Gavin Newsom said in the announcement. Back home, New York finally announced dates on the seed-to-sale BioTrack implementation we discussed with BioTrack's Chief Operating Officer, Mo Afena, a few months ago in Episode 2. This past November, the Office of Cannabis Management announced its timeline for requiring that all licensees secure an electronic inventory tracking system that is capable of integrating with BioTrack, the system that holds the contract with the state. OCM announced last week that the first deadline is August 1 for cultivators, micro-businesses, registered organizations, and labs. September 1 is the deadline for processors and distributors, and October 1 for dispensaries. Also, the New York Cannabis Control Board met last Tuesday, and while the agenda included more than a dozen items, it was no surprise that licensing queues dominated the discussion. Before the CCB approved 52 new adult use licenses, bringing the total to 1,726, Chief Operating Officer Patrick McCage gave a detailed update about the remaining licensing queues. At the April CCB meeting, during which multiple public comments directed outrage at the queues, and an audience member repeatedly interrupted the meeting to do the same, CCB Chair Tremaine Wright requested that McCage bring specifics about the queues to this meeting. From the approximately 1,600 applications in the November queue, Patrick said, 619 received final licenses, which means they can open. 203 got provisional licenses, which means they still have some outstanding aspect of their application. 441 applications are pending, and 340 have been closed, which includes those that were denied or withdrawn. Some applications that were closed, however, may eventually be reconsidered after a judge recently ruled against OCM's decision to award only one license per entity in the November queue. The December queue, in which there are 4,666 distinct applications, includes the following pending applications. 2,706 are for retail, 886 are for micro businesses, 169 cultivation, 117 processor, and 182 for distribution. An ongoing lawsuit is preventing OCM from processing provisional retail dispensary applications that applied without a location, McCage said. The December queue has attracted particular anger because many of these applicants have been paying leases since submitting their applications in late 2023. Board member Crystal Rodriguez-Dabney said that the board needs to have a plan for moving more quickly on applications not held up in litigation. I have yet to hear a viable excuse for why we're not addressing or processing those licenses or applications, Rodriguez-Dabney said. We all look forward to the answer to this question. Thanks to Cannabis Wire for that news. Check out Cannabis Wire at cannabiswire.com. My guest today is Brian Applegarth. Brian is the leading expert in cannabis and hemp tourism. He pioneered initiatives such as the Cannabis Travel Association International and the Cannabis and Hemp Hospitality Training Course. He co-authored the first national study on the cannabis travel audience in the United States. He is a recognized global leader in cannabis and hemp tourism, developing and implementing destination customized stewardship strategies, preparing destinations and unlocking opportunities for growth and economic impact. Brian speaks on cannabis and hemp tourism at conferences around the world, and we're very fortunate to have him on today. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Herb. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me on.
Well, thank you. This is a unique opportunity for me because I've been very interested in the cannabis and travel tourism sort of opportunities that New York State and New York City in particular has. And just yesterday, there was an article on how this week's Fashion Week very strongly incorporated cannabis into its activities, and not just in the activities, but also on some of the runway activities that went on. So again, something that's unique to New York and can only happen here. So I wanted to first get your reaction to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the intersectionality, right? Like, when you have events like Fashion Week, Restaurant Week come to a destination or exist in a destination, it's a lightning rod for activity, including economic activity and spending. That includes visitor spending, right? It's not resident spending. It's people who are coming to a destination, investing into the local economy, and then going back home. So that discipline is a really important strategic opportunity for the cannabis industry to constantly look at. And I think it highlights that intersectionality. I look at Fashion Week as the intersectionality with arts and culture, which is one of the many spokes on the wheel when you look at the travel ecosystem, from hotels to rental cars to museums, cultural attractions, and beyond. And
all right, so we'll get into all of that, but let's, when people think of cannabis tourism, right, the first place that comes to mind is Amsterdam, right? So can you talk a little bit about how that evolved and sort of just regionally and around the world?
Yeah. I mean, well, the global history of cannabis is fascinating. It's found in cultures throughout the world, and the application of cannabis going back into a very far in history is really a fascinating space to look as well. As far as Amsterdam, really in the 1970s is when the first coffee shop opened up in Amsterdam. So it's interesting. We talk about cannabis lounges in the United States, in California, New York, but the cannabis coffee shop model is what was born in Amsterdam in the 1970s. And since then, Amsterdam has had kind of a quasi-legal cannabis market. So that's an interesting study in itself, because it's kind of been this gray market model, which is really, when you create a framework that's gray market, everything evolves in a very specific way, depending on how you frame up that architecture around evolving an industry. So Amsterdam's coffee shop culture became very inhalation forward and heavy, because, that framework kind of encouraged that kind of specific growth, I guess I would say. It's really interesting because Amsterdam, I saw some data back from like 2016, 2017, so it was a little dated, but this was by the Dutch kind of Amsterdam Tourism Authority group there. And when you look at the tourists that came to Amsterdam, 1 in 4 visitors would go into a coffee shop to have an experience, right, while on vacation. Would they smoke weed? I don't know. It depends, but the travel audience wants to have these interesting experiences regardless, and it may not always revolve around consuming or consumption. The other data point was, well, 1 in 4 would go into a shop. 1 in 10 visitors to Amsterdam actually cited cannabis as what we call the destination driver, which means that was the primary reason they were going to Amsterdam, and booked the plane ticket, booked the hotel, booked the restaurants they were going to eat at. So when you look at a travel audience where 10% are citing it as the driving force behind a destination, it really starts making the case for destinations like New York to say, who is the cannabis travel audience today? And how do we entice visitation from them? Because we are a cannabis integrated destination where we want to be able to provide, experiences for visitors. I think the other thing I'll mention about Amsterdam is you can look at the Bulldog, which I consider kind of a tourism empire that really was born out of tourism. They were the first coffee shop lounge in Amsterdam. Now they have 2 hotels. They have 4 clubs in 4 different countries. They have merchandise shops that are souvenirs with no cannabis products. They are a case study on the potential of what a cannabis brand or business could become if they intersect in a very smart and strategic way that's data-driven with the global travel economy, which is about 10.2% of the global GDP.
So coming back to the U.S., how did the early adoption states like Colorado, California, how did they incorporate tourism into their businesses? And are there lessons there for New York?
Well, really, if we're talking about tourism in kind of the legal market era, let's say it goes back to 1996 when California legalized medical marijuana. And all of a sudden, you started seeing an influx of patients that were looking for access to safe medicine that was being tested. And so really this medical tourism era of compassionate use and people wanting to treat ailments where they were at their kind of wits' end, or they were trying to proactively find solutions that were not found through traditional applications. California became kind of a beacon for that patient profile for medical travel. And then today you have the adult use model where, we recreationally legalize cannabis. In travel speak, that means leisure, right? So not medical travel, but leisure travel. So when the era of leisure travel started in Colorado, there was, what we learned is there was a major uptick in hotel room bookings, right? So you started seeing the economic benefits of a travel audience wanting to be there when the very first cannabis adult use legal shop opened in the first state that had that kind of adult use recreational market. So there's all these now strategies and moments to be able to think about how does a destination drive economic and community vitality through cannabis and hemp travel and tourism. So yeah, those were some of the benchmarks. Something else we learned is that there's a lot of different types of cannabis travelers, right? Because it spans from medical to leisure. So a really great way to think about this, what we've learned over the years, is cannabis is a travel trend that is anchored and grounded in wellness and well-being, right at the intersection of medical and leisure travel.
So on the medical side in California, did the traveler have to see a physician in California before being allowed to purchase medical cannabis?
Still being figured out. Unfortunately, the compassionate cannabis industry really got left behind in some ways. When adult use kicked in, there was a whole flood of energy and money that really started shifting the mindset away from patient care and wellness, unfortunately, to the detriment of the industry's kind of authenticity, I think, to represent an ancient medicine plant. So, but you had a lot of new actors come in the space that, with dollar signs in their eyes, and it kind of shook it up a lot. And we're just now starting to see a circle back toward wellness in a more grounded way, away from just the high THC kind of quick BOGO, buy one, get one free mentality, low price leader. And it's interesting because that mentality of just moving more product at a lower price is very much kind of pandering to resident spends, not visitor spends. And the psychology behind resident spends is very different than somebody who's visiting a destination and how they spend and where they spend. So the cannabis industry, I believe, is just starting to wake up to the power, especially those shops like in New York that are actually located in what I refer to as tourism-based economies, places like California, where the travel economy is a $150 billion economy. You start seeing how do you start intersecting cannabis and hemp people and brands and businesses with the differentiators that you exist within. And with destinations like California, Florida, New York, where you have a high amount of transient travel and tourism attention and energy, having a dedicated budget and a strategy where you are unlocking travel industry partnerships and visitor spends is, I believe, paramount if you're located in those destinations.
Obviously New York State, New York City already have a great tourism infrastructure, right? The hotels, the restaurants, tour companies. Now, how can they adapt to be able to be, not just ready, but to start doing this?
Right. Well, I think it does start with being like destination preparedness, right? Like a destination needs to think holistically because you have your destination brand. So the brand of New York State, New York City, all the different boroughs. How are they thinking about what is our cannabis and hemp story? Or do they have a lot of cultivation there? Do you want to lean into genetics and craft? Or do you have lounges with nightclubs where you're pairing cannabis with the theater and the arts? So it's really understanding from a brand point of view, how does cannabis dovetail into our destination brand in a really smart, authentic way? And then how do we start nurturing and working with cannabis stakeholders to become part of our story? Because these are businesses that are serving visitors that are part of the tax-paying ecosystem of a destination now. So that integration is basically what I do, is I work with destinations to integrate travel-worthy cannabis strategies and partners and programs that can help integrate cannabis into the greater destination stories.
So who should be doing this? Is it sort of ad hoc in the individual, hotel, the individual restaurants, or should it be, does it need to be a governmental association that is doing this, a governmental organization? the Chamber of Commerce?
I would argue it starts with like destination stakeholder level. I'd say like the rule makers, the destination organizations, marketing organizations, destination management stewardship organizations, chambers of commerce. And where it really starts is stakeholder education and data. Like you've got to go in initially and you have to re-educate because people still have that reefer madness stigma that is very strong and it's lingering, right? People think of inhalation, they think of people getting high, and they're missing the greater kind of context as to what is real today. So you've got to start by bringing in an expert to talk about what is cannabis and hemp, what is it today, and who is the cannabis motivated travel audience in the US? And the answer is that's about 72 million Americans that will pick the destination that they're going to visit based on the ability to have a cannabis experience while on vacation. I also want to point out that 24% of that 72 million person travel audience in the US do not identify as cannabis consumers, but they do love great experiences. It's just like somebody going on a coffee farm in Hawaii that may not drink coffee, but they want to see the local craft and the local culture. And that is kind of a unique differentiator from the cannabis consumer audience that takes up most of the air most of the time.
So what types of experiences have you seen that are sustainable, profitable in other markets?
Sustainable and profitable in other markets. Honestly, I think people are still figuring it out because cannabis is an excellent tool for the experience economy product development. But I think we are just on the cusp of people really starting to unlock how to make that a significant revenue generating source. What I mean by that is cannabis in the experience economy is very different from cannabis or hemp. And it's not a commodity. It's not a product. It's not even a service where it's time saved. The experience economy is time well spent. It's buying a ticket for a 90-minute experience where you unlock multiple revenue streams. And it may not even be one that's a cannabis product. You may just have an educational thing and a book and some food and some beverage and be learning about the endocannabinoid system. That alone could be a tourism product today. So it's being able to understand that. The destinations that are most advanced with this concept is Humboldt County in the Emerald Triangle has a wonderful tour by Humboldt Cannabis Tours where they have
in California.
Yeah, California, right? Absolutely. California there. West Hollywood is fascinating. Coachella Valley, this week was at a lounge that is tribal owned where they have food and beverage, craft beer flights, and cannabis coexisting. They have stage with entertainment, that kind of thing. Those are the ones that I really see. Of course, Amsterdam in its own way, but it's going to be interesting to see how Amsterdam's starting to regulate the cannabis supply chain in a more legal, clear way. So that's going to unlock, I think, more innovation depending on how they enable kind of the manufacturing and the topicals and all the other products to come forward in spa, beverage, culinary. So that's the exciting part. You're seeing cannabis go beyond just the smoking a joint into a whole concentrates connoisseurship scene. And then the other direction, you're seeing it really become relatable for all the non-inhalation microdosing applications of beverages, craft cocktails, culinary, that kind of thing. So yeah, I'd say California, I feel like is the most mature kind of modern day destination right now with I think we have about 100 lounges in the state, maybe more, that are licensed lounges providing experiences. And I'll say I love how you're seeing music and art show up and performance art show up is really something special. I almost look at it as kind of a mix between the beatnik era and kind of the hippie era, and this, you're seeing comedy and poetry reading and burlesque shows and open mic nights and songwriter nights, as well as bands. And it's got a very different feel because people are really tuned in a different way than an alcohol bar, right? So it's fun to see this kind of history in the making happening.
So are those sort of new emerging concepts in tourism for cannabis that New York can replicate? Like, for example, the restaurant and food scene in New York is almost, unique and one of the most unique in the world. How could they begin to take advantage of?
So I don't know if you've brought in any, so I've worked with about 25 destinations, some in Canada, some on the East Coast, a lot in California. And typically what I recommend is getting the conversation current is what I say. So that's, again, it goes back to like getting everybody educated, including the Restaurant Association of New York or whatever, and letting them understand of, obviously I think everybody understands that a lot of cannabis has an abundance of myrcene, which typically is associated with appetite stimulation. So what does it mean having a visitor go to a cannabis lounge and then go to a restaurant? And what is the incremental spend where you see another spend happen because of the munchies or somebody that intentionally wanted to enhance flavor, taste, and texture through cannabis? And how are we framing that up to connect cannabis to the culinary food scene, right? Same thing with arts and culture. And I think the travel agency, that cannabis shop in Manhattan's doing this, where they've partnered with the theaters, which I love because I'm a fan of theater. So being able to position cannabis as an enhancement tool for a night on Broadway is like an amazing development that I saw. I also saw the Vincent van Gogh kind of thing that happened out there, right? So I think when I think of New York, the arts and culture and the culinary scene, I think are really unique pairing mechanisms, which I use this model called effect pairing, basically, as food pairs with wine, cannabis pairs with activities and experiences. And how do we continue to nurture that connection that literally is informed by the data? Like the data around the cannabis travel audience shows that this audience is already connecting that dot, that cannabis is a precursor to an arts and culture or a foodie experience. So how do we nurture that as a travel vertical with an entheogenic product, right? So.
Absolutely. And yeah, arts and culture was the next question. So you hit on that, and then really within an hour, right, you could be in the Hudson Valley and you could be seeing a farm, talking to the farmer, right, seeing the products, right from the start.
Yeah.
What regulatory frameworks have you seen that have been supportive of cannabis tourism? Is there one?
Yeah. No, I think the most enabling destinations I've seen are Oakland really stands out. They their cannabis is deeply embedded in their culture and their communities. It's been around for a long time. So there's a very healthy, vibrant trail that Visit Oakland has developed that features the travel-worthy cannabis lounges and shops, as well as locally made products, as well as effect pairings. So at each of these locations, there's literally recommendations, typically within walking distance of, after you visit this lounge, go to this cafe, get this specific foodie experience, and then, take a walk over here to Lake Merritt and enjoy, the sunshine and the nature experience. That's another thing we see consistently with the cannabis travel audience is this appetite for natural nature-based environments, which is not surprising at all, in my opinion, but that's also a through line. Another destination that I think has vision for this is Mendocino County. They've really done a good job on gathering up their hotel partners that are cannabis friendly. They have amazing craft cultivators. They have multiple stops along the cannabis trail, which is like a cultural trail that travels through Northern California. There's also 5 landmarks in Humboldt. So it kind of allows people to go on a journey and to learn about all the different stories of cannabis and hemp and how it's influenced California's culture and history. Travel Santa Ana has a passport program where
I know you're in California right now, and I know you may be partial to California. Is there any other jurisdiction, any other state that how about in Canada? Is anyone in Canada doing good work around this area?
Totally. There's one is I want to give a shout out to the Canadian Cannabis Tourism Association. They're doing amazing work at the federal level to support the government to strategically understand and integrate cannabis tourism strategies. So they're the first to do that because of the federal legalization status up north. So they're doing a great work. They're also putting on a festival this year for 420, which is a cannabis tourism festival, which is wonderful. The Kootenay Rocky region, which is kind of like the old school Emerald Triangle of Canada, where BC Bud, if you heard of that, British Columbia, that region is starting to really develop kind of like a craft cultural tourism strategy up there, Kootenay Rocky region. There's two destinations. There's one in Michigan called Fields Cannery, which is like a It's basically like going on to a craft beer Lagunitas thing where you have stages and, they really are building it with tourism in mind. So that's another great one in Michigan. Another visionary is a guy named Aaron out of Colorado, who's standing up the first club that I've seen where you actually meet with a hostess and it's like a full experience from A to Z with a piano and charcuterie and it's a very high touch kind of cannabis club that's just about to open. So those are some of the standout kind of things that I've seen in other states and other countries as far as cannabis tourism attraction.
Do you have a sense of what the potential in revenue in New York State might be, once it's operating in this area?
Yeah.
And I know it's a tough question.
Yeah, I'd have to crunch numbers and look at New York specifically. I can tell you that from a national lens, Whitney Economics, Bo Whitney, did crunch some numbers around the cannabis tourism opportunity. And basically it was cited as about a $17 billion opportunity. And this was like 2.5 years ago. But basically for every visitor dollar spent in a cannabis shop, an additional $2.80 was injected into the local economy, which is that's that tourism incremental spend, right? And that added up to basically a $17 billion opportunity that just the cannabis tourism model was. Now, if you look at, I pulled up some data around New York's, tourism industry because, right, it's a tourism based economy. In 2024, New York attracted 64 million visitors. It was the second highest in the country. The tourism generated over $6.8 billion in tax revenue for the city and supported over 388,000 jobs. And it's approximately 9% of the New York City workforce, right? And then I'm sure if you look at it from a New York State level, it just gets wider. But I think that just shows when you look at the California cannabis industry, for example, is like a $5 billion industry on a good day, and that is rapidly shrinking. So when you start looking at bigger industries as ways to partner and grow, this is the opportunity of tourism. Travel is an established industry and cannabis is part of it now. So what brands and businesses are going to show up and be a great participant and partner with the tourism economy strategy for your destination?
Right. And you mentioned that, in the study that had been done in Amsterdam, that 1 out of 10 visitors went with a specific purpose of participating. And that doesn't mean that that 9 out of the other 10, the remainder didn't participate, right? Once they're there, they say, hey, I'm here.
Yeah, 1 in 4 actually participated, but 1 in 10 cited it as what we call the destination driver, like the reason they chose New York, for example.
Right. So just some free advice for New York. What can they be doing now to prepare for this market?
Yeah. First off, New York's a dream destination. I hope to be able to work with New York at one point. I see the intersectionality for New York City. I think the intersectionality of cannabis with arts and culture and food is a really interesting place to go very deep. I would also encourage, as this gets developed, it's not just allowing visitors to be bystanders. Cannabis is extremely inspirational and creative. So having creative endeavors that visitors can participate in while in an altered state is, in my act, that's kind of a form of well-being because you're kind of, you're thinking in a different way and you're creating, which is a really powerful space to be in, especially when you're on vacation in a new inspirational place. So I think the hands-on arts and culture experience is something really special, possibly in New York as well. And just the food. This could also be hands-on, like, little cooking classes, making pasta, as well as eating and indulging in that way. I also want to point out that cannabis, it does have the capability, several of the different cultivars of cannabis, especially those with an abundance of myrcene, have a capability to, stimulate appetite, accentuate palate, flavor, taste, and texture. Again, it's personal for everybody. I'm not a doctor, but a lot of the research is pointing to this. So enhancing a food experience with cannabis, I think is going to be an entry point for all destinations. When you have Michelin star restaurants and the kind of decadent food scene that New York has and diverse food scene, you could really have a cool elevated kind of foodie tour and continue to stitch together all the things that make New York amazing with cannabis included. So
Absolutely. One of the things that I often ask guests is any advice for this, either the Office of Cannabis Management, the legislature, or for the governor?
Yeah. I mean, I would encourage the governor. If I know that not all states have it, I don't think, but there's these tourism conferences, the governor's tourism conference, and considering the power of cannabis and hemp to be a new addition that's really valuable for the economic benefit of the state of New York, to not really drill down on the opportunity for cannabis and hemp to really expand and evolve the New York brand and the New York visitor economy. The more that conversation gets left out, the longer and further behind a destination will get. And there's a lot of first mover opportunities now on the global stage where, you just follow the earned media performance. I mean, these cannabis experiences are speaking to a larger and larger and larger audience because of the nature of it, from medical to wellness to leisure. Not to mention all the group meetings and conferences, the events, the B2B. I mean, there's so much money on the table through travel. And I feel like a lot of the conversation gets left out because of stigma. They don't understand the audience that's waiting to spend money on this. And until you make room so you can actually have awareness about what's on the table, it's impossible to make a strategy. So I would encourage all of those organizations you mentioned, all those levels of leadership, rule makers, to invest in understanding the data, what the landscape is today, and then start building the foundation for what is our plan. We have tax-paying businesses that are part of our community, that are cannabis businesses. And so, yeah, that first step is really important to start healthy conversations and take advantage of what's on the
No, I agree. And my view is, now that it's legal, you have to lean into it, right? I mean,
right.
Deal with the stigma and lean into it and really take advantage of the opportunities for somebody else.
Not to mention Herb public safety. So as you mentioned in my intro, I created the cannabis and hemp hospitality training course. That training course is for frontline staff at hotels, tourism information centers, and of course, cannabis shops and lounges that are on the tourist track. But it's for the whole community, because now there are humans that are eating cannabis or drinking cannabis or smoking cannabis, and sometimes they're in an altered state. So in the spirit of not just public safety, but visitor safety, as well as frontline hospitality staff safety, because this is a new thing, investing in your destination to be prepared is really important. And that comes down to skill development and training for the people that are interacting with visitors that want to understand where to get cannabis, where to use it, and what they can do.
Yeah. Has any jurisdiction done a marketing campaign, sort of like I love New York weed instead of just I love New York?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually, last year we had a cooperative marketing campaign. We had 3 destinations that came together, and they all were part of the foundational year of the Cannabis Trail Cooperative Marketing Campaign, which is that 9-county cannabis cultural trail in Northern California. That includes the Emerald Triangle and, of course, San Francisco and the other places where there's a lot of history and culture. And that was the foundational year. And it was celebrating all the ways that hemp and cannabis are part of California's history. Down to the missions where you still have hemp artifacts, right? The California missions, as well as the first hemp store in the United States was in Humboldt County, in southern Humboldt. So we tell stories about the pioneers, the places, and the people that are part of the cannabis and hemp story of California. And visit Oakland, visit Mendocino County and and Humboldt County Visitors Bureau that represents all of Humboldt County, all came together around that cooperative marketing program last year. And we worked with about 9 different media outlets to tell a story to different audiences about the Cannabis Trail, which, again, we're inviting people. Now you can not just travel the Napa Wine Road and the Marin Cheese Trail. Now you can travel the Northern California Cannabis Trail. There's also been several destinations that have done marketing, but typically it starts with, hey, Brian, come in and educate stakeholders, bring the data. Once we get past that first foundational lift, Then you start going into brand and marketing and what's our story and who are our key partners and who's going to help us tell it. And so, yeah, but there's definitely marketing strategies happening right now. Yes.
All right. Well, terrific. Brian, thank you for your time today. Really valuable discussion, very important discussion to be having. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Herb. Appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. If you found today's discussion valuable, consider leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more listeners find the show. Better yet, share it with colleagues, advocates, and anyone interested in the future of cannabis in New York. Joint Session is produced by me, Herb Barbot, together with executive producer Robert Curtis from Simlev Media. Special thanks as always to Cannabis Wire. You can follow us on Instagram at jointsession.pod and on LinkedIn at Joint Session Podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions, reach out to me at herb.jointsession@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Herb Barbot. Thanks for listening.